Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about something that has been a long time coming. The Daily Wire is dead. It's over. It is effectively over. And this has been unfolding for the last 2 to 3 years. If you really look back on it, their downfall really started when they ousted Candace Owens. However, there has been an ever-increasing velocity as to why the Daily Wire collapsed in the manner in which it did. Currently, a lot of people are attributing it to not just the loss of talent, that being Candace Owens as well as Brett Cooper, but also to some of the poor choices, financial and business decisions that were made along the way, including passion projects floated by former Daily Wire head Jeremy Boring, which ultimately failed and helped sink the business financially. Now, all that said, today we're going to be looking at a Washington Post article titled "Inside Ben Shapiro's MAGA Meltdown," which covers a lot of this background information and gives us a glimpse into how even the mainstream press is now interpreting the unraveling of the Daily Wire. Now, to be absolutely clear out the gate, so we can understand the cultural and political context of what is happening and its importance, Ben Shapiro was famously a never-Trumper. When Trump initially ran in 2015, one of the biggest reasons why he broke away from Breitbart and Steve Bannon was because he did not support Trump politically, stylistically, or ideologically. He went off and created his own organization because he believed he could build a more disciplined, more intellectual, and more quote-unquote respectable version of conservative media. Ironically, the tables have now almost completely flipped. Ben, much like many other Israel First creators in the conservative space, has gone from never Trump to effectively forever Trump. Largely because Trump has become one of the most aggressively pro-Israel presidents in modern American history. Even Benjamin Netanyahu himself recently stated that Israel may never again have another American president as supportive as Donald Trump. That reality has created enormous tension inside the conservative movement because there's now a widening divide between traditional neoconservatism, Israel First conservatism, and a younger America First populist base that is increasingly skeptical of foreign entanglements, foreign lobbying, interventionist politics, and Israel as a whole. And this is really the core issue that the Washington Post article is effectively dancing around without directly saying it. The Daily Wire did not just lose viewers because of business mistakes. It lost viewers because the ideological center of gravity of the right began shifting away from them. Now, it's no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention that the Daily Wire's subscriber growth has either plateaued or declined in 15 of the last 16 months since the start of 2025. Their website traffic reportedly dropped by roughly half year over year by March. Ben Shapiro's YouTube views have reportedly collapsed by nearly 70% since late 2024. Videos that used to pull millions of views now sometimes struggle to even crack meaningful engagement numbers. And honestly, this is not surprising at all when you understand how the internet has evolved. The Daily Wire was built for a specific era of online politics. It was built for the Facebook algorithm era: fast, anti-social justice warrior clips, viral outrage headlines, campus ownage compilations, woke college student destroyed type content. The company mastered the art of monetizing culture war engagement at exactly the right time. But what they fail to understand is that online political movements evolve incredibly fast. Audiences get bored. Audiences end up realigning and becoming increasingly cynical of things that they once liked. And eventually, the people who once looked like insurgents or dissidents begin looking like institutions themselves. And that's exactly what happened to the Daily Wire. They slowly transformed from a disruptive outsider company into the very thing they originally claimed to oppose. And I think Candace Owens honestly summarized this best in the article when she argued that the company increasingly became preachy, self-righteous, and intolerant of dissent. Her point was not just that the Daily Wire became boring. Her point was that it lost authenticity. It stopped feeling like a movement and started feeling like a corporation managing narratives. And once that perception settles into an audience's mind, especially a populist audience, it becomes almost impossible to recover from it. Populist audiences hate gatekeepers. They hate institutions. They hate feeling managed. And one of the biggest mistakes the Daily Wire made was assuming that because they were conservative, the audience would always view them as anti-establishment by default. But eventually, people began realizing that the Daily Wire had its own approved narratives, its own ideological boundaries, and its own sacred cows that could not be questioned. And nowhere was that tension more visible than around the Israeli topic. And that fracture first became apparent during the Candace Owens split, which was not just some random internal HR dispute. It became symbolic of a much larger ideological fracture taking place on the right. Once Candace Owens started openly questioning aspects of Israeli policy, that being Zionism, foreign influence, and interventionism, the conflict inside the Daily Wire exploded publicly. Ben Shapiro, whose politics have always been deeply tied to strong support for Israel, increasingly found himself at odds with a rising faction of younger conservatives who view unconditional support for foreign governments as fundamentally incompatible with America First politics. And what's interesting is that even the Washington Post article essentially acknowledges this reality by framing Shapiro as a representative of an older conservative establishment faction that is increasingly losing favor with younger populist conservatives online. The article quotes analysts basically admitting that the energy online is no longer with polished institutional conservatism. It's with independent creators, live streamers, podcasters, anti-establishment personalities, and decentralized political media ecosystems. In other words, the future of political media is personality-driven, not institution-driven. And that shift has completely undermined the Daily Wire's business model. But beyond that, one of the biggest self-inflicted wounds the company suffered was its obsession with trying to become an alternative version of Hollywood. This is where Jeremy Boring truly enters the picture. The article details how the company went on this enormous spending spree over the last several years, trying to transform itself from a conservative media company into a full-blown entertainment empire. They launched Daily Wire Plus, invested heavily into movies, children's content, streaming infrastructure, documentaries, merchandise, fantasy productions, publishing arms, and massive entertainment projects that cost extraordinary amounts of money. Some of these projects performed decently, particularly documentaries by Matt Walsh like Am I Racist? But many others appear to have been complete financial disasters. The article specifically references the Pendragon Cycle, an expensive fantasy series reportedly costing millions per episode with elaborate international production and visual effects work, yet the associated audience numbers appear almost non-existent. And this perfectly captures the core identity crisis of the Daily Wire. They spent years claiming to oppose Hollywood while simultaneously trying to become Hollywood. They mocked corporate entertainment culture while desperately seeking legitimacy from within it. In fact, you could drive around Los Angeles a few months ago and you would see billboards begging the Academy to give Ben Shapiro awards for his podcast. And that's a great irony around the Daily Wire. They position themselves as anti-establishment outsiders while slowly building a giant corporate media bureaucracy that attempted to literally recreate what they were claiming to want to destroy. And people noticed that contradiction. Now, what makes this situation even worse for the Daily Wire is that many of the personalities who left the company immediately proved they did not need the institutional backing of the Daily Wire anymore. Brett Cooper left and rapidly built an independent audience online. Candace Owens left and remains massively influential. Adjacently, Tucker Carlson left Fox News and did the exact same thing, arguably becoming more powerful online than he was on cable television. Megyn Kelly, same trajectory as Tucker. The lesson audiences are learning is that they do not need giant media corporations anymore. They follow personalities directly. They can just engage with the people they like without having to provide their attention as essentially ad dollars for these mega corporations that just want to push out a singular message. It's been a long time like this on the internet, but more than ever, audiences can follow individuals they trust. Institutions no longer control audience loyalty the way they once did. And that reality is devastating for companies like the Daily Wire that spent years investing enormous amounts of money into trying to become a permanent conservative media empire. Now, obviously, to be fair, the Daily Wire is not literally disappearing tomorrow. The company still has millions of listeners. They have major infrastructure, they have investors, they have brand recognition, and a sizable audience. Ben Shapiro himself responded to this article, arguing that the company is still profitable and still significantly larger than many of its critics. But the issue here is not whether the Daily Wire vanishes overnight. The issue here is trajectory, momentum, cultural relevance, political influence. And by every major metric, the company appears to be moving in the wrong direction. In fact, they have already conducted multiple rounds of layoffs. To some speculation online, close to 60% of their staff was laid off. Jeremy Boring stepped down as CEO after a major scandal in the last year. Their traffic is collapsing. Their online engagement is collapsing. Their ideological coalition fractured publicly. Their biggest talent left or simply turned against them. And perhaps most importantly, the audience no longer views them as insurgents. They view them as part of the conservative establishment itself. And as I mentioned in a recent interview, conservatives don't like the establishment. We like outsiders. We like insurgents. We like people who challenge the order and stand on business. And that is really the broader story here. The decline of the Daily Wire represents a collapse of a specific era of conservative politics and conservative media. The late 2010s model of donor-backed, professionally managed, pseudo-populist conservative media is losing its grip on the internet. The audience has become more decentralized, more anti-establishment, more skeptical, more hostile toward the institutional narratives pushed by companies like the Daily Wire, by Fox News, and more willing to abandon personalities and organizations the moment they sense any level of inauthenticity or ideological gatekeeping. The Daily Wire rose during a moment when conservatism was still heavily centralized around major media institutions, but politics has evolved into something far more fragmented, tribalistic, and utterly chaotic. And frankly, I think the company fundamentally failed to adapt to that reality. Some would say it was actually impossible for it to adapt because of its behemoth of a corporate structure. Because instead of staying lean, insurgent, and culturally agile, they became bloated, corporate, ideologically rigid, and obsessed with Israel and building legitimacy within systems they originally claimed to oppose. And in doing so, they slowly lost the very audience that made them powerful in the first place. And look, at the end of the day, this ends up being a lesson that is constantly relearned on the internet. And honestly, it's a lesson that I myself have learned over the years, perhaps in the harshest way possible. The internet changes very quickly. Tastes shift quickly. Audiences evolve quickly. People adapt. People change their minds. Sometimes you are afforded, by the grace of God, the ability to move with the shifting winds of culture and politics. Other times you get left behind. Some people survive every cancellation attempt imaginable. Others get wiped out the very first time they get hit. And unfortunately, those decisions are never fully left up to the individual sitting in front of the camera. Ultimately, those decisions are made by the people behind the camera watching. They are the ones who decide what resonates, what feels authentic, what feels truthful, and what no longer connects with them. That is the real marketplace of ideas. And unlike almost every other industry or product, media, especially internet media, is incredibly difficult to fake. You cannot fake authenticity for long because audiences operate heavily off instinct and intuition. They go with their gut. The moment there is a disconnect between what somebody says and what people believe they actually are, audiences begin pulling away almost immediately. You cannot endlessly reposition yourself toward whatever is politically or financially advantageous in the moment because eventually people see right through it. And over time, if you consistently say things that do not align with your actual conscience, your actual beliefs, or who you really are, eventually you begin collapsing internally as well. There is a spiritual incongruency that develops when somebody sells their soul for peanuts, basically, for relevance, money, influence, or institutional approval on the internet. And eventually that catches up with people and organizations alike. Ultimately, and I do have to say this, there is something a little bittersweet about the collapse of the Daily Wire. I started watching Ben Shapiro back in 2016 and 2017. I watched him heavily throughout the Democrat and Republican primaries in 2018 and 19 and into 2020. He undeniably had a massive influence on online conservative culture and internet politics broadly. I remember when he collabed with PewDiePie back in the day. I remember when he made his first appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. I remember the Logan Paul interview where Logan Paul almost seemed nervous to openly engage with Ben Shapiro's point of view because at the time, culturally, it still felt dangerous to be openly associated with conservative politics online. And you could tell Logan Paul was a more middle-of-the-road guy politically, but also trying to signal toward the left because that was what was culturally dominant during that era. Ben Shapiro absolutely played a role in helping introduce conservatism to younger audiences in a more polished, rhetorically disciplined, and intellectually accessible way. At the same time, I was nowhere near as red-pilled on Israel or foreign policy as I am today. Back then, like many Americans, I had the privilege of mostly not thinking deeply about foreign policy issues. I was far more focused on domestic politics, local issues, the economy, culture, and national American politics. Foreign policy simply was not something I spent much time thinking about back in the 2010s, but even then, it still stood out to me. I remember thinking to myself, wow, this guy is really, really pro-Israel. He really loves Israel. There was always something about it that felt disproportionate and difficult to fully understand at the time, and it's interesting looking back now and seeing how central that issue ultimately became, not just for Ben Shapiro personally, but for the future of the Daily Wire itself, because I genuinely think one of the reasons the Daily Wire is collapsing now is because we are living through a historic shift in public opinion around foreign policy, interventionism, and America's relationship with Israel. And I do not think that is coincidental whatsoever. The Daily Wire became arguably the single biggest explicitly pro-Israel conservative media company on the internet at the exact same moment Americans, especially younger Americans, began seriously questioning America's unconditional relationship with a foreign nation that has increasingly become associated in the public mind with aggression, war, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and overall regional instability in the Middle East. Whether people agree with that perception or not is honestly beside the point. The reality is that perception exists in mainline conservatism and left-wing politics right now, and it is rapidly expanding. And you can see this conversation happening on every level of society today. You see it politically, culturally, and academically. You see it at college campuses, in independent media, just casual conversations by the water cooler. Frankly, I have never had to talk about Israel, Zionism, lobbying, and foreign influence since I started running for office, and I never expected to have to talk about it this much in my life. It has become unavoidable in American political and cultural discourse, and ironically, despite the Daily Wire spending years aggressively pushing pro-Israel narratives, that entire strategy appears to have just completely imploded right on their face. And honestly, I think that is because there are limits to narrative control. There are limits to propaganda. There are limits to how much influence money can buy. The Daily Wire's downfall is symbolic of that reality. You can build massive media infrastructure. You can spend enormous amounts of money on all of that. You can have institutional backing, major donors, elite connections, polished production quality, the president in your back pocket while you have enormous online reach. But eventually, if the public fundamentally stops trusting the narrative you are pushing, none of those things can save you. And that is what we're watching happen right now. Ben Shapiro was incredibly effective at communicating conservatism to a younger generation in a polished, articulate, and rhetorically sharp way. I mean, I just mentioned that a moment ago. That is undeniable. That is what he will be remembered for. But ultimately, his unconditional support for the state of Israel became the issue where a growing portion of the public simply couldn't tolerate what he was pushing anymore. That slop is why they stopped following him. It became the issue where his audience and his worldview increasingly diverged from one another. Because at the end of the day, no matter how sophisticated media operations become, no matter how aggressively narratives are curated, managed, and pushed out, and no matter how much money gets poured into shaping public opinion, eventually people arrive at their own conclusions. The truth is undeniable. People see things for themselves, they hear things for themselves, they make up their own minds, they talk to their friends, and once all that happens, the truth begins speaking louder than anything the narrative can do. And by the way, I am saying all of this as we continue to see many reports of Israeli-linked lobbying groups and media companies shoveling hundreds of millions, if in some cases, in some reports, billions of dollars to try to influence media narratives and public opinion here in the United States about sentiment surrounding Israel. Yet despite all of that spending, despite all of that institutional pressure, despite all of that media coordination, public skepticism toward Israel is still rapidly growing, especially among younger Americans. And I honestly do not think that trend is going to reverse anytime soon. If anything, it is only going to intensify the more propaganda gets shoveled in front of people's faces. Because if there's one thing Americans fundamentally dislike, it is being told that they are morally obligated to support something, especially when it involves a foreign nation that many Americans feel has little direct connection to their daily lives. Americans historically react very negatively to this sort of coercion, this sort of ideological enforcement, and to the perception that we are obligated to adopt a specific political position because it benefits our so-called greatest ally. And I think a lot of people are now reacting against exactly that dynamic and thoroughly repudiating it. That's why the Daily Wire is falling, collapsing, and Ben Shapiro is riding off into the sunset of irrelevancy. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.